Hi, Daniel.
Hello, how's everyone doing? Ashton, good to meet you. Matt, good to see you again. How's everyone doing?
Doing
Likewise.
well.
Good.
Yeah, good to see you,
Delightful.
Daniel.
It's good to see you. You've been doing all right. I really enjoyed your talk with Michelle Bowens. I adore Bowens, so that was a great talk.
It was yeah, really I'm embarrassed that I haven't gone too deeply into his work before, but we're gonna have more conversations soon. So it was great to meet him. Yeah.
Well, his work is kind of infinite, so no worries. Like there's always like no matter how much I read, I'm like, oh, I'm at the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg. Oh, okay, but it's quite profound. And Ashton, I will say as well, I had no idea about that Owen Barfield lecture, and it was really, really cool. I actually had my MP3 player of maybe 15 years. And I was out in the tomato garden cutting all of the dead vines, listening to Owen Barfield's voice. It was really great. So thank you for introducing me to that.
Of course. Yeah, it was a real delight for me too when I first discovered it because I had read the lecture before because it's in the book that Matt has right there. But yeah, to hear him and there's a documentary, I don't know if you know that on YouTube about him that he's in as well. There's probably other like a few other recordings of him speaking, but yeah, it's great. Yeah.
Well,
No,
before we launch in here, in case the people who will listen to this later have never heard Owen Barfield speak before, let me share my screen and just share a minute clip from that particular lecture, which is Barfield sharing probably my favorite couple of sentences he ever wrote.
You'll sometimes hear people say they have no metaphysics. Well, they're lying. Their metaphysics are implicit in what they take for granted about the world. Only they prefer to call it common sense. Or maybe that sounds obvious enough. When we study consciousness historically, contrasting perhaps what men perceive and think now with what they perceived and thought at some period in the past. When we study long-term changes in consciousness, we're studying changes in the world itself and not simply changes in the human brain. We're not studying some so-called inner world divided off by a skin or a skull from a so-called outer world. We're trying to study the world itself from its inner aspect. Consciousness is not a tiny bit of the world stuck onto the rest of it. It is the inside of the whole world.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So there you have it.
I
That
was
about
about
sums
to
it
say
up.
that part was one of my favorites when he says, "Well, they're lying," because I just like, yeah, as what because there's so many moments throughout his writing, right, where he says something kind of sassy that makes me laugh out loud, and that is definitely one of them. Yeah,
no, he's actually hilarious. Like there are
yeah,
these witty little moments where you burst out laughing. No, it just kind of they're lying. Drops the mic. It's really funny.
yeah.
There's one point in the discussion too where somebody asks him, "Can you define perception?"
No.
Yeah, I know I felt bad for
No.
her, but he said already, yeah.
No, I can't.
I just took an hour in an attempt to do so, and I guess you weren't listening. So, maybe let me ask a question here of each of you just to get the ball rolling here. I'll start with Ashton, even though I kind of know the answer, but again, for the sake of the listeners, what's your relationship to Barfield? How did you come to his work? Um, don't answer why you think it's important yet. We'll come back to that.
Yeah. Well, I encountered Barfield's work first in the philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness program, which you teach in, and also were a student in. Yeah, I had heard about him before, just based on some things that I described being interested in. Some friends suggested that I should read poetic diction in particular, but I didn't actually read Barfield until I took a course called A Brief History of Western Thought with Jacob Sherman, who's one of our professors as well, and he assigned Saving the Appearances at the end of the class, and I read it in one day, and it was just yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's been so many, so many compelling thinkers that I've encountered during my studies in PCC, but this book in particular just had such a profound impact on me. So yeah. That's and I'm writing a dissertation on his work, so yeah.
Did we lose you, Daniel? Are you with us? Oh, you're
I
back.
think I am. I don't know why that happened, but I'm here. I heard what he was saying.
Great.
That's weird.
Yeah.
Sorry
And
about that.
what about you, Daniel? How did you come into Barfield's orbit?
Oh goodness. So let's see. So first there was this period where I lost all faith in all the thinkers that I was told I needed to read for philosophy, and started kind of going outside of it, because I was like, there's this whole realm of thinkers you're not even led to believe. You know, when I'd say the first I came upon was Michel Planier, who wrote a book called Personal Knowledge. Then I came upon a man who's relevant here named Alfred Korobowski. So I started just kind of going through, and then I was like, I got into Steiner, and then Steiner led to Barfield. I'm like, who? There was a who part of the Inklings I didn't know about. And then I read the intro to Saving the Appearances, and it's like one of the greatest introductions to a philosophy book ever that just sticks with you. He's like, hey, is a rainbow there? And that's when it kind of blew my mind. And then what really caught my attention is this idea of language is kind of incorrect. If I get any of the language wrong, please correct me, on kind of fossils of consciousness, and that there's some way that language records changes of consciousness. For me, if what Barfield and Steiner and them is talking about, because I like economics, it's actually incredibly relevant to economics, because if you want to create new markets and new values, then it would have something to do with modes of consciousness. And there's also reason to think from the history of economics, from say a Dietrich McCloskey or like Karatani or different people, that the way people are toward the world impacts how value is organized. And taking someone like what Barfield is putting forth seriously, if it is, and I know this is an entire like economics and Owen Barfield, what does that have to do? Like, to me, it's extremely relevant, because if we need to think about new values and new markets today, this question of how to transform the way that people are told toward the world, and then is language part of that secret sauce? Does language change consciousness, or is language just a record of consciousness? Is it a feedback loop? What's the relationship between those two? That becomes really fascinating. So that would be kind of some of the trajectory. I lost faith in all of the thinkers they told me were the only thinkers I need to know in philosophy, and started to go outside of that and discover this whole new world.
Well, I mean, a very easy connection I can make between Barfield and economics is just to say that people should go out and buy his books.
Yes.
Because he's underread. And yeah, I think you're a poet. I mean, poetry becomes, for Barfield, the means by which language becomes something we consciously partake in, rather than having it be what thinks for us. Because depending on the direction of our imaginal creative capacity, right, we are either thought for by language, or we become productive of our own consciousness, and by proxy of a different kind of world, if we can, as Heidegger might say, dwell in language poetically. And so it's not incidental that he was a member of the Inklings. Most people have heard of C.S. Lewis. Most people have heard of J.R.R. Tolkien. And Barfield is, because of his influence on both of them, probably actually way more influential than people might first realize, right? Because of how he shaped these two giants of literature. So, okay, next question. Well, let me just say, I think it was also Jake Sherman who introduced me to Barfield. I had already read some Steiner, and so it was the opposite direction as you, Daniel. I went from Steiner to Barfield. Oh, sorry, you did the same direction. We're on the same page. But it would almost be easier for people to start with Barfield and work their way to Steiner, because he's such a, I think of him as performing the same role that Coleridge kind of did for the German idealists by bringing them into the English language in the early 1800s, that Barfield kind of plays for Steiner, and comes up with this wonderful phrase, romanticism come of age. That was Barfield talking about anthroposophy, right? That's not something Steiner ever says. Yeah. So Barfield's been one of these really crucial 20th century philosophers for me who can make Christianity compatible with an evolutionary worldview, which I think is one of the major tasks that we're still faced with, but we have all these tremendous figures to draw upon who've contributed so much to that synthesis and integration. So I've already kind of hinted at why Barfield's important just by saying that, but I wonder, Ashton, what hit you when you first read Saving the Appearances and then got deeper into Barfield's work that made you feel like, oh, I want to spend several years of my life studying this man's thoughts?
Well, I think it was because sort of similar to what you were describing, Daniel. I was thankfully I was in PCC in this philosophy program that, you know, where we're studying these thinkers and orienting ourselves to these big questions. But prior to that, I had an experience that really left me in a state of a kind of metaphysical confusion and feeling of bereftness. And I felt that more so than any other thinker I had encountered yet, Barfield sort of gave me a sense for how to like a path forward into the future, and also that being bound up with a kind of cosmological orientation, that but in a cosmos that is in an ongoing evolutionary process, you know, and so as 21st century people, we're sort of conditioned into this way of thinking anyway, that, you know, that we're bound up in an evolutionary process. But and so he brings those features of, I guess, our imaginary that maybe we're kind of unconscious of to the fore. And yeah, so that I'll stop there. That's a little bit.
Daniel, what about you? What's important enough about Barfield that makes you so excited about his thought, and what are you continuing to think with in his work?
Well, one, just listening to his Sandra's voice on the lectures. I mean, I could do that all day long, but the Ashton said that was so good. So, you know, a few things. First off, I like Ashton's answer. I mentioned Alfred Korbowski. So many years ago, I was reading Neil Postman, and he mentioned this thinker named Alfred Korbowski and said he was a super genius. I'm like, who's that? And he wrote this book called Science and Sanity, and he basically argues the following, to take 900 pages and condense it into 2 sentences violently, is that human beings, it is just as important the framework, or he talks about semantics or structures of thought that we operate in versus just the information. Because he makes the example where he says, imagine you were trying to do modern cosmology or mathematics with Roman numerals. You were stuck in that symbolic. He said you go crazy. You couldn't keep sanity, right? That literally the symbolic you choose impacts the kind of thoughts you can think. And if you encounter things in the world and you don't have a symbolic that would fit that, it will lead to insanity. And so what he's trying to argue for, he really focuses on semantics, kind of that sort of world, but really he goes to war against something called what he calls identification. He's basically looking to update Aristotelian logic. And he's like, Aristotelian logic has really gotten us to trouble. And he really convinced me that we needed some sort of framework that made relations, processes, stuff like networks real. Otherwise, we would go insane. Which also plugged into a lot of the work I did on David Hume, from like Norm Kemp Smith and Donald Livingston, where he starts the Human Treatise warning that basically there's something, he calls it philosophical melancholia, would be unleashed upon the world unless people figured out a way to make idea and common life relate with one another. And all of his thought experiments, deconstructing self and all of these things, are basically showing, hey, at the end of the day, ideas have to be in a relationship with some sort of percept, or else you're going to have philosophical melancholia, which basically we could associate with the meaning crisis. But here's the problem. It really wasn't until Owen Barfield that I felt like I found a really robust metaphysics to actually do what Korbowski and David Hume were trying to get at, right? Because like I was convinced of what Korbowski was saying, but the project he went about doing it, I wasn't convinced worked. But what you see in Owen Barfield is a metaphysic or a philosophy that actually could give you a legitimate new way of understanding the world that would help you avoid some of these melancholias or insanities that Mr. Korobowski was talking about. And really, it's hard to forget the rainbow example when you come upon it. Like, that's the most famous thing. If anyone knows about Owen Barfield, you know about the rainbow thing. It was
Did Daniel
so
freeze for you?
crisp and
Oh,
so
now you're
clear
back.
right out of the
Daniel, we
gate of
lost
the
you
first
for
thing I
about
read of the
5 seconds. So let's let it catch up here. Hold on a second. You're still frozen for us. He's frozen for you too, Ash.
I can't see him. It's just a blank gray screen.
Nope. We lost him. I think it's, oh, there he is.
I
Hey,
keep freezing. I've not had this kind of trouble in a long time. I'm so sorry. Oh my
that's
gosh.
okay. That's okay.
Mercury is in retrograde. Oh, it actually just went to direct today. Never mind. But
Can't
still,
blame Mercury.
glitchy. Yeah.
I am so sorry. I was saying stuff on Korobowski and stuff like that. And basically, like, I was convinced of the kind of philosophical melancholy of Hume. I was convinced of the insanity of Korobowski, but I didn't think either of them necessarily provided the metaphysics or the framework by which to actually address the things that concerned with it. And then when you come upon saving the appearance, and then of course, everyone, if you know of Barfield, know of the rainbow example, like that was such a, like, that's real, that exists, like this is undeniable, and to make that as a kind of reference point for a new symbolic or a new framework by which to address the concerns of these other thinkers became very, very powerful. So those would be some things I would say.
Yeah, lovely. And so, this evolution of consciousness that Barfield introduces us to and presents as an alternative to the history of ideas, so that when we study someone like Aristotle, say, we have to embody an entirely different civilizational outlook, an entirely different sort of perceptual gestalt. And the ideas that are in Aristotle's metaphysics or whatever are only comprehensible and digestible in that context. And so, 2000 years plus later, when we have modern science telling us, for example, that Aristotle was wrong about the ascending spheres of the supralunary realm, and that the Earth moves and all of these things, and yet we're still very much thinking in these old logical categories. That is a crazy making situation. And what's brilliant about Barfield, and I think he's drawing on Steiner here a bit, is that this new scientific perspective is not simply a fall; it's also an evolutionary. It's a source of evolutionary resistance, as it were, that forces the human being to continue to move through a process of metamorphosis at the level of our consciousness and our being. And so science becomes not just about, modern natural science is not just about increasing our knowledge. It's about the transformation in our sense of self that it allows to unfold. And the 20th century, culturally, politically, was a mass insanity on some levels. And Barfield is doing his work in the midst of all of that and trying desperately to convey this sense of the evolution of consciousness, and this deeper understanding of the nature of modern science, that it has isolated the human spirit, to the extent that we can even refer to ourselves as spirits anymore, from what appears to be a merely mechanical world. And this example of the rainbow immediately short circuits that easy separation, right, between subject and object, and invites us into a renewed form of participation, which was still residual in Aristotle, but was lost as a result of modern science. And Barfield's trying to invite us back into a directionally creator relationship, right? And so, I've tried to sketch that basic historical story that is so important for Barfield's work there. But I know, Ashton, this movement from original to final participation is right at the core of this book, Saving the Appearances. What does it, how do you understand the difference between, say, that and a history of ideas? So if we're to understand the significance of Aristotle's philosophy and the kind of thinking that would be required nowadays to restore some sense of connection between our own subjectivity and the wider world, how does the evolution of consciousness help us do that? And why is it so different from just a history of ideas?
Well, so I think Barfield in that lecture that you played an excerpt from and elsewhere, he makes a distinction, between the history of ideas and the evolution of consciousness, and says that there's a certain point in the evolution of consciousness, which is also the evolution of nature and the cosmos, that there's a certain point at which self-consciousness and thinking, like kind of directed thinking, come online, so to speak, and start to participate or intervene in that evolutionary process. And so he thinks of the history of ideas as at least one aspect of the history of ideas, especially in connection with the evolution of consciousness, is as a means of a symptomatic expression of what's going on below the surface. So he says the evolution of consciousness, there's a kind of like formal character to it. And if you know anything about Rudolf Steiner, this was very mysterious to me until I learned more about Rudolf Steiner, because I did discover, I did hear and read a little bit of Steiner before I read Barfield, but I didn't get into Steiner until Barfield kind of warmed me up to him. But the more that you, I guess, look into Steiner and anthroposophy, the evolution of human consciousness is described as, or portrayed as, being bound up with this kind of angelic precession, a temporalized great chain of being. And so that is one way to, because he actually alludes to it in Saving the Appearances. He's like, I'm not going to actually address what could be, the unrepresented or like connected with the particles, and like what is in that lecture that you played an excerpt from, what these mysterious forces that are connected with the unconscious evolution of consciousness. But yeah, so when directed thinking, and the kind of poetic diction that goes with that comes online, there's this potential to deviate actually from the kind of providential course of evolution. And so the directionally creator relation to the phenomenal world, it is this phrase Barfield uses to characterize the kind of essential situation we find ourselves in this formal, like there's like a shape to the evolution of consciousness for Barfield, and basically the way he describes it is that we've gone from an experience of the world as active object, as like sort of speaking meaning into us, to becoming subjects ourselves. But with that, there's been a kind of like enclosure in our subjectivity, and the directionally creator role refers to that our collective representations are a kind of they're the worldview, I guess, and they can more or less be diaphanous to the kind of spiritual intelligences that are giving rise to it. And so the directionally creator role, basically like we can either fill ourselves with more I guess illusions, and so this is why even just knowing the world for Barfield is not is an affair of the whole person, or we can do what he describes as enhancing figuration, and Goethe and Steiner are the exemplars of that, and that is basically to sort of progressively see through the appearances even more deeply to than these kind of spiritual beings. So anyway, that's a long summary. I'll stop with that. You pick it up from there.
So the phenomena that we see with our physical senses become not mere material surfaces, but signs and symbols that can be read. There's a meaning there to be uncovered, but we need to restore this kind of participation. And so, yeah, Daniel, what do you think about this? The empowerment that Barfield is attributing, the power, I should say, that he's attributing to language and poetry. Do you think that this is the right medium to turn to in order to transform consciousness? Poetry? I mean, what about film? What about other art forms? I mean, are those themselves forms of poetry? Or because I know you like to you're quite an accomplished poet, I would say. I've listened to some of your work on YouTube. So yeah, what do you think about Barfield's relationship to poetry and its role?
You're gonna make me blush, Matt. My goodness. Maybe we'll freeze when I'm blushing, and then you'll have a permanent image. So we will see. No, that's tremendous. So I think there is very good reason. So there's a few things. One of the things that Owen Barfield, I think it's just actually true. Like in the history of the English words, like literature and words uniquely give you an insight into the consciousness of a people. I think Gadamer in Truth and Method talks about art as being the best way to get at history, because, and even someone like Hayden, the great historian Hayden White, talked about one of the mistakes is we read history as facts versus literature, and as a result, we can't enter into history. And so there's something very important about literature, because it has to be married to the kind of way the people see the world when they write the literature. It's just impossible to do otherwise. There are various theories too. Like there are some people, I don't remember who came up with this theory, on the idea that you see the birth of a certain individualized subjectivity between the Iliad and the Odyssey. You look at Momensis by Auerbach, where you compare Abraham with, Homer. And Homer, every detail is expressed orally, but then when it's written down, it's much scanter because it's much more psychological. I mean, you could also bring in, there's obviously Marshall McLuhan with the medium in this, but like William Ong, for example, on the idea that the movement from oral to the printing transformed how consciousness experienced the world. Now, there's a question there. Is it the information technology, or is the use of language that the information technology puts forth that changes consciousness, right? Well, like if Owen Barfield is correct about language, then language is actually the primary medium of the transformation of the mode of consciousness, and the information technologies are simply, I don't want to say accidental, they're the medium condition that I'll talk about instead of the material or the ideal condition that invites a new way of dialogue that transforms the consciousness that is toward the world. And if Dietrich McCloskey is right, that a change in how people spoke in the Dutch Empire created an explosion of wealth, if Jonathan Rauch is correct in Kindly Inquisitor that how people speak transforms information, then yes, language is absolutely at the center of it. And then anecdotally, in my experience, people who read literature not as surgeons looking for, the secret intention of the author, but to let the idiot of Dostoevsky wash over them, or the poetry of Wallace Stevens, they talk different. They think different. They enjoy things. They have a different value set. Now, that's completely anecdotal. But then when we look at, say, Randall Collins looking at network effects, they take the Inklings. These guys are all talking about literature and writing and poetry and all this different stuff. And then they're also philosophical and theological. I think when you look at history, and I don't think it's just literary people talking with literary people, I think when you look at the use of language whether it be a William Ong, a Marshall McLuhan, Neil Postman, when you look at an Alfred Korbowski on the very structure of language, if it entails, his big thing is rooting out isness from language. And he basically wants to restructure the structures of thinking and language without isness, which identification I would associate with the idolatry that Mr. Barfield is putting forth. So both of them, so the way people talk absolutely changes how they're told the world. And the reason why this is then also extremely important is because on the question of where does value come from, you know, we were talking about the solo residue in the last conversation, like axiology. I know with the physics of world spirit, this idea with Whitehead that value, creativity is kind of central. Language might be precisely the kind of training zone of those capacities of subjectivity that have very big practical impacts on the world. And so I think the stakes are very high, and Owen Barfield and Steiner, in this very close analysis of the history of language, which then follows into some of these literary critics, make an incredibly strong case that language should be central in our thinking, because language. And I was also just going to comment quickly, like on this idea, Owen Barfield also on this idea of how reality is toward us, if it's relational. I can ask, you know, the fact that I experienced this bookcase as brown, how is that for consciousness? Like it's an invitation to think about myself in relationship to the bookcase. Phenomenon become, the percepts invite you for that. Well, language does the same, because you're actively choosing what kind of experiences for the other you're putting in the world, how things are inframed and shaped towards you. And I think that, like, the capacity of people to speak to one another. Well, the last thing I'll say on this, what is most of society, if you like, when you think about like dating, what's like all of dating kind of about a lot of times? Conversation, going to dinner and talking. What do you do at it mostly? You have a meal and you talk. Like, it's actually incredible how much of social infrastructure is designed around the speech act. Like, it's actually incredible. Now, yeah, you can go to movies too, but you know, most people are like, you really should have dinner before that and speak. And what do they always say? Conversation and relationship is a big deal. Communication is a big deal. Like, you see glimmers, you see in a sense glimmers and traces here and there in all these different areas of some kind of increasing realization that the speech act is really important. You can then even get into psychoanalysis on like a Lacan, or for all these different people talking about the speech act being important. And a society that is not able to engage in a more literary speech act, that is not really able to kind of own these things, is going to have a different subjectivity from other people. And that will have, and then this would be my closing point, this has practical impacts. This is not merely decorations. This is how people are toward one another in the society, and will also impact the kind of values that are practiced and interacted in. And if we want to talk about new economics, new markets, new politics, then this is going to be a central question to the kind of training of that kind of subjectivity. So I'm convinced of it. And again, I just, from anecdotal evidence, I think about like people who do poetry. I had a lot of interaction with like spoken word artists through Bernard Hankins or the hip hop cipher. We work with young kids at UNOYAs and different things, and how much that change of relationship to language and the kind of creativity and the hope and meaning that actually would come out of that change relationship to meaning was incredibly obvious, incredibly obvious. And so I think Owen Barfield's work just helps provide scaffolding and justification for some of those anecdotal experiences as well. But let me pass it on.
Yeah, beautiful. You know, I'm just speaking of McLuhan and Ong and the importance of and attending to the medium. You know, here we are on Zoom. We're not at the Eagle and the Child in Oxford, where the Inklings used to drink beer, and they called it the Bird and the Baby affectionately. Been to that pub. It's not what it used to be, apparently. But this conversation mediated by this technology puts us in a quite unique situation. You're in Virginia, Ashton's in San Francisco, I'm here in Oakland. Totally different context in terms of where our bodies are. And we're recording this and others will listen to it. We have no idea who they are. It's a rather unique situation that affords some things and inhibits other things, right? But I like the expansive way you're talking about language here, because language, as I hear you speaking to it, uh, Daniel, becomes sort of like a meta medium. I mean, all of these mediums are language in some sense, and we exist within that. We inhabit language, um, and the importance of recognizing how language is not just. I mean, it can become cheap talk, it can become gossip, it can become overly abstract, and just to bring in the uh, incarnational side of this, which is quite literally crucial for Barfield and the evolution of consciousness. The logos is made flesh, right? And so we live and die by the word. The ways that we talk to one another, we create one another, and we create the world we share together in the ways that we engage with our poetic power. And so what a responsibility. Jeez. Yeah, I don't know that I have another question for you, Ashton, but in anything that's been said thus far, I mean, are ideas occurring to you that you'd like to throw into the mix?
Well, yeah, I think a couple things. One way Barfield talks about the evolution of consciousness with respect to language in particular, and like the role of language, apart from language and ancient languages and etymology being this source of insight into the past, is that he says that language, and this kind of sounds maybe like Heidegger, but it's different in the sense that he says, well, maybe I don't know enough Heidegger. Maybe I don't want to be too totalizing there, but he says that language was a kind of tool through which we forged our subjectivity, and that it precipitated out of this primordial experience, immediate experience of meaning in the world, and that the world itself is language like, and that memory is really what first, the process of internalizing the word-like world through memory, is what gradually leads to language, and then language itself facilitates a kind of emancipation from just the total unity with the life of nature, but also there's this potential to be locked in the virtual enclosure, that language that is no longer um, reflective of an inner continuity between the human soul and the soul of the world can lead to. But yeah, and that Barfield, he was sort of led to these discoveries out of an experience of his own kind of like null point. He describes it in his early 20s. He had very kind of dejected, unrequited love, very intense depression. But he noticed that he was reading a lot of romantic poetry, and he said that it had this, the words and just letting the poems wash over him had this reaction on his perception of the world, and that's what initially led him into this inquiry. He wanted to understand like what's going on here. And so yeah, as as Daniel was saying, literature can transform our relationship with other human beings and our perception of the world, and if we're part of the world, then that matters. Yeah.
Yeah. Daniel, please, whatever's coming to mind.
No, that's beautifully put. And again, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but there's a way in Owen Barfield where there's like this capacity to define, to make distinctions, to kind of pull apart, has a potentially positive role in that. Now, this is what I'm a little fuzzy on this, so correct me if I'm incorrect. There's almost a way in which in the nation of Israel, there was a need for distinction to separate from idols, like to separate it, like to not be infected, to participate in the idolatry. But then if you go too far, it becomes its own idolatry because you actually make things standalone. So there's a way in which distinction can be important as a defense, like so that you're not participating in bad things. But then it needs to move toward a final participation where it almost distinction is used to enhance the whole, to enhance the participation. And there is something, about how do we see distinctions in the world in order to hold, to see, and to release back into, like the pull phenomenon, to look at them, or to call that a bookcase, or to use language in a way to focus, but then not capture it, like keep it apart, right? There's a way in which you need to release it back. And there's something about poetry, I do wonder if it kind of uniquely teaches you that, because it gives you a sort of like, it gives you a language experience of reality that doesn't let you grab reality and hold it like a technical knowledge, right? It actually enhances your experience of things. And that, I think, is like, how do we get better at using language in a manner that when we draw distinctions, it's in order to enhance the whole, per se, to enhance consciousness, not to have ownership. Right? Like that seems to be the big problem in economics now. Like how, if we talk about the commodity form, the commodity form could be useful. It could be useful to have the mode of exchange where I'm able to say $20 is worth that lamp, but then it's very difficult for the lamp not to equal $20 and to be reducible to $20, as opposed to the lamp having values beyond the commodity form. There's something about, because I always think about modes of exchange that Koratani talks about, and I know that the great Bowen's brought up Koratani, who I think highly of. Exchanges are kind of languages. Like the way we exchange things, it communicates information. And the problem is that it's very difficult to have exchanges with reality that then don't come to be the dominant mode of exchange, where we just think of everything in terms of the commodity form, or just think of everything as, oh, that could be a symbol in my short story. There can be that too, right? Like you're going around just looking for experiences to put into your art on different things. What poetry seems like good poetry can do is bring you a new relationship to reality that doesn't lose sight of the harmony of all the multifaceted relationships with reality, right? And that seems very important, because then, like, if nihilism and meaningless and stuff like that, if that's a result of the wrong relationship with reality, for Mr. Kowalski, it would be according to identification, or we could say, for him, he didn't use the term reductionism, but it's basically that. If you knew that there were different ways of relating to the same object, if you knew there were 13 ways of looking at the blackbird, to use that Wallace Stevens idea, then if you found a way causing nihilism, you could just switch to another one. The 6th way of looking at the blackbird's not that great, so let's try the 7th. Let's try the 8th. Let's move around, right? And if poetry, I think poetry has a way of saying, hey, that cow pasture, that field you've looked at all those times, you actually can choose the way you look at it. You can actually describe it in a different way. And then this suggests what as I understand Steiner and freedom and consciousness are strongly tied together. And poetry introduces to you, hey, you have freedom over how you experience that. And if you're free, then you can be free from the depression. You can be free from the nihilism, because you can choose the way you look at the blackbird, per se. But of course, this introduces a new responsibility, dare I say a new horror, because wait a minute, if I could look at the same thing many ways, how do I know which way to look at different things, right? But this is where then maybe poetry is also important in literature, because you come to learn when you say write a short story or a poem, that sure, you could describe the sky infinite number of ways, but there actually is a right way to do it, given the consistency of the story. There is a better way to do it. But this betterness is tied to a fittedness with the entire situation of the work. It's a more situational and relational ethics, if you will, or orientation of right and wrong of the artistic act itself. And so the last thing I'll say before I pass it on, I think poetry also teaches you how there is better and worse, even if there are many options that are not obvious what is better, but just thinking of how they relate, how the pieces of the poem go together. There is a better way to do it than not. Sometimes describing the sky as cerulean is better than azure, and sometimes not describing it at all, and that's not merely subjective. There is actually a right and wrong in the artistic work, but it's not reducible to simplistic, objective, subjective, relative, whatever. That is something I think poetry unlocks consciousness to experience, which can then unlock you to a new horizon of freedom. So I definitely think language, and poetry in particular, has that capacity of habituating you to a multifaceted experience of reality.
Yeah, I think a lot about the sin of literalness and or literalism, and how important it is to remain in a poetic relationship to language, such that we both don't lose sight of what you're saying as sort of aesthetic realism, that there's real value there to be conveyed, and we can do better or worse at that in given different situations with our choice of words. But we also avoid um, just a sort of nominalistic relativism where it's like words, the meaning of words is just convention, and there's nothing real there that corresponds to the meaning of our language. We're kind of just making it up in our little social circles, and it's kind of a collective solipsism, these collective representations that we're imprisoned in. Poetry does allow us to break through to the real. So rather than it, just being fantasy, it's imagination, poetic imagination as an organ of perception, right? And even speech, Barfield drawing on Steiner would think of speech as an organ of perception. And actually Steiner has this whole interesting esoteric physiology that I won't pretend to be able to rehearse in any precision here, but basically the mouth and the ears for Steiner, the larynx and our organs of hearing are actually one organ that allows us to perceive speech, right? Because we don't just talk, we have to hear too for this to work. There's a listening and there's an active and a passive side to it. But also, like, perception, I think one of the invitations here from Barfield is to recognize that perception is already symbolic, and language is just a further development of the meaning evident in our perception of nature, right? And so we're not making up the meaning with language, with our words. The fact that we can have words and speech is only possible because our embodied perceptual encounter with the aesthetic display of the cosmos is already meaningful, right? And the issue is we've moved from that original participation where the direction was from world to human in terms of the meaning, and now we're in a position where, because of our freedom, that vector has reversed, but there is still a real meaning to be known, to be deciphered. And so it's, there's something about 20th century art and poetry with, surrealism and these forms of a movement towards the absurd and a celebration of the insane that I think is evidence of this null point that you mentioned, Ashton, that Barfield talks about, where we're not yet participating, but in the phenomena in a intimate way, but we're recognizing our own freedom as creators, but we're just still kind of free floating. And so when we look at the last century or so, what does Barfield contribute to allowing us to move beyond just that sort of postmodern nihilistic condition where it seems like the best you can do there is just have this heroic existentialist stance, and whatever, either you commit suicide or you engage in the Sisyphean task of making meaning that's ultimately grounded on nothing. How does Barfield get us beyond just that existential predicament? What do you think, Ashton?
Well, as when Daniel was speaking earlier about this sense in art of there being some kind of context-based measure for what is right, what will make what is appropriate to the piece. And it made me think of Coleridge, in Barfield, right? It's all about Coleridge, and I think of that as like the secondary imagination and its measure is informed by the primary imagination, which is what weaves the world. So it's that a kind of piety to the world as it's been given to us, and that's why for Barfield and for Steiner, Goethe is this exemplar of the way forward, because he models this kind of fidelity to the world without, and that this when it's not the case, when it's not, I guess, when we're not focused on trying to the more kind of, I guess, scientific aspiration to get to know the world without, but are maybe more focused on like something like art, that or even just the way that we live our lives, that we have this aspiration to create in like manner. And so that this measure that's based on the context, it's a kind of relational, right? A relational approach that also has a transcendent dimension to it, and also like a kind of livingness to it. When you brought up Steiner and freedom, I was thinking earlier of what poetry, this potential of poetry to break us out of the literal, and to be able to participate in the ongoing life of the world in each context, and then life becomes a kind of art that way. And so this is a way in which we're connected back with, but now with self-consciousness, that immediate potential for an immediate experience of meaning in the world that language, Barfield thinks, precipitated out of. I'll stop there.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Anything coming to mind for you, Daniel, that you'd like to
No,
share?
that was a beautiful answer, and my children might be playing a water balloon fight in the hallway inside at night, so I can't tell. So that would free consciousness, right? That would elevate us into different perspectives of the talk or different things. No, I think what Ashton said was beautiful. I think the first thing that comes to mind is if you like everything that Ashton was just saying about the way of experiencing the world. It is hard for me to imagine someone experiencing the world in that way and having a meaning crisis. So then there's a kind of question of, how do you experience the world right there? What is the training well? It seems like you just had to have been lucky and in high school had that special English teacher. Like everyone seems to have had that special English teacher or something. Like there's some sort of like secret sauce, if you will, that leads to a certain thing where, people, for some reason, some people went walking in the woods taking photographs or thinking of science fiction stories, right? And there's this sort of, well, definitely the emphasis that Barfield has on imagination as being somehow primary or very important, if you will, that seems true to experience. Like if you have a rich imagination or you're imaginative, there's almost a way in which you don't think about nihilism because you're just imagining things. There's a kind of self-forgetfulness that kind of occurs, right? That seems quite powerful. Like, because there's a question of, can I just tell someone, can I give you like a formula and say, look, the universe has meaning. See? Will you start to feel like you have meaning? That doesn't seem to be how it works. It has to somehow, you fall in love with it. I think, Barfield has you only know by falling in love with, right? Well, how do you fall in love with a meaningful universe, if you will? It does seem like the act of imagination is the literal act of being in love with life. Like there's something about it that seems to be, I love life. And look, there's a creativity that erupts from it that like, sure, maybe you imagine something that doesn't exist and that is not factually represented. But imagination has some kind of love in it, some kind of love of life in it, that if love is necessary for knowing, which is an argument, well, then the imagination seems necessary for having the right relationship with being to enter into a kind of meaningfulness and love necessary for knowing it. And so it does seem like imagination is really important. The other thing I would say to that, because I'm really interested in Barfield's claim, I might be mistaken, and if I am, correct me, that imagination is a real way of knowing reality. Like it gives you real knowledge, right? That seems to be true. Like if you you know, I approach Barfield with a kind of like, yeah, that seems to be true to experience. It's not just like fantasy. It's like, it does seem to be the case that you learn more about relationships from Chekhov than you do like psychology papers or something. Not to say that psychology papers don't matter, but it seems to be like good writers read psychology papers to figure out how to then write literature that aligns with the psychology papers, but you need to see it unfold in the unique situation of, say, Russia, or maybe the Compton family in The Sound and the Fury, that if it does not do that, there's some quality missing that then makes it less true to life, right? And so it does seem to be the case that actually engaging in art or imagination somehow actually does make you better prepared for, say, difference or otherness or pluralism. Now, I don't want to overly universalize that because, you know, if you only read, say, certain stories from a certain culture or a certain view, that could be problematic. But it just seems to be the case that actually engaging in imagination and studying literature and doing poetry or thinking the humanities or dealing with philosophy actually equips you in a unique way to deal with reality qualitatively, like in terms of quality. And so Barfield seems to be correct about that. The other thing I was just going to say too, then the question becomes, what is the role of imagination? And this is where I think this point that you're making there, Matt, on this idea that it's not that there is already something symbolic, something in the percept already. The reason why that's very important is because then imagination is not about adding something to the tree, but it is to be inspired by rightly seeing the tree. That rightly seeing the percept and seeing it as itself then unleashes a kind of meaning that inspires the imagination. The way I would describe this is Flannery O'Connor. She hated symbols in stories. Like, she went to a writer's party in New York once, and somebody asked her, it's like, what's the symbolism of the hat on the misfit's head? And she's like, to be on his head. It's like, she's like, she hated, like, you know, and she, like, all these writers are like, well, the symbolism, she's like, if it's just a symbol, I don't care, and like left and different things. And what she, in this essay, that's really remarkable, she was saying, you know, from a Christian background, if you believe that God made the world, then everything already is a kind of sacrament. It already has meaning. If you add symbolism to the rock, you're actually hindering the sacrament. The effort of making it meaningful is precisely why it's not. Your job as the writer is to just describe the rock as it actually is in reality. And if you successfully do that, meaning will come forth. She's basically saying the reason why all these stories don't impact people anymore or have meaning is because people are trying to make them have meaning, as opposed to simply describing an actual rock or an actual tree, right? The reason why this is so important is because then I think what she's saying is correct. If we can really almost in a Cezannian way see reality, like actually experience it, that's then inspiring to imagination, as opposed to having imagination add meaning to reality. Instead, imagination takes off when we actually see what's there. And I think this also kind of suggests, and then I'll close, this kind of suggests the relationship of empiricism to imagination, science and humanities. Like, you need to really see what's there and to really understand it. And the argument of Flannery O'Connor is that basically the more you understand reality and really see it, and don't let yourself be captured by a preset metaphysic or framework, the more it can actually inspire you and actually lead to falling in love with reality. But the order then is to really honor the person, really honor what you're experiencing and relating to, and that will unleash imagination, as opposed to using imagination to turn everything into a symbol of something. That's the mistake. Which then, you know, the irony is you would think, no, shouldn't imagination turn the tree into some sort of symbol? No, you should have a right relationship with the tree, and then trust that imagination will explode from off of that. And I think Barfield gives that, and I think it aligns with Flannery O'Connor's essay as well.
It reminds me of something Whitehead says in his book Symbolism, where he says that sometimes the poet goes into the woods to be among the trees so that the trees can suggest the words. And that, usually we think of the word tree as symbolizing the real tree, but for the poet, sometimes the real tree can symbolize the words, right? And so again, perception is already symbolic, and there's an evolution of consciousness underway, and it would be nice to think that it's just a progression onward, better and better, toward better and better modes of life. But I don't know if that's how it works. And we have all these artificial intelligence devices, machines, programs running, being developed and improved. And it has me wondering about the problem with not having any perceptual basis for the artificial intelligence that is operating. These machines don't have percepts, they don't have emotions, they have no sense of emotional resonance with the world. It's all based on symbols it's symbols from human writing that these machines have been trained on. And so there's how Plato would talk about the images on the cave wall are like twice removed from the real. And so these machines are only trained on symbols twice removed from the real. And it's just all deduction and statistics. And we're increasingly being convinced by our collective way of representing these technologies that they're actually thinking, actually understanding, that artificial intelligence is equivalent to our own kind of intelligence. And that is in terms of the evolution of consciousness, talk about an adversarial sort of situation where we're faced with this new form of even more non-participatory intelligence that's externalized to ourselves and increasingly being given agency, quote unquote agency, that we're really it's a bit of an evolutionary bottleneck right now. The pressure is on for human beings to rediscover a participatory relationship to their own embodied experience of the world, because all of the media, all of most scientists at least, are really working overtime now to convince us that machine intelligence is equivalent to or even superior to human intelligence, right? And so there's a real opportunity here, but also plenty of peril in terms of the directions we might go in, and the degradation of our poetic power and the poetic basis of our own minds as we give over that power to these large language models, right? And so it seems to me that Barfield's work is so much more relevant and important now as language begins to we might want to say take on a life of its own, but it's not alive at all in these machines. It's algorithmic, right? And so talk about idolatry, right? So I'm not to rush you, Ashton, but I think your dissertation is important. You got to get it out there. Barfield's ideas need to be better known because it's game time now. So yeah, I mean, in Steiner's terms, we would talk about the incarnation of Ahriman in the context of these new technologies that are embodying a particular kind of calculative, abstract intelligence. But Barfield has a way of translating this into terms that are less immediately, a turn off to people who aren't already steeped in this work. So, and one other thing I want to share in response to what you were saying, Daniel, about like what happens to people at certain times in their lives that clues them into what love for the world can do for overcoming meaning crisis, for restoring a participatory relationship. And I think it's pretty simple. You already said it. It's like having that special teacher when you're an adolescent, that through being an exemplar as an adult to a young person, you can embody and imbibe the virtues of this love for the world, and you want to be like that too. And it's the basic pedagogical responsibility that we have to young people. Basically our most important gift to the younger generation is to convey a sense of that love and of the power of your own imagination, and how miserably we fail to do that today, right? It's a real, if there's so many emergencies, but like not inviting the next generation into the fullness of the human experience, I think is a tremendous loss. Yeah. Any thoughts, Daniel?
Well,
Yeah.
not to jump in, so
Okay.
forgive me. Ashton, did you want to go?
No, you go ahead.
No, because everything that's all magnificent. So there's a few things. So absolutely, for me, evolutions of consciousness are kind of marked by these new problems, which are precisely the invitation, because evolution is not a simile for getting better. It just can be changed, right? And if it's good or bad, well, that's kind of the freedom. The freedom is that you could screw it up, or it can be an invitation to a new kind of beauty, right? And so and also because we are free, we can choose to identify with language models and make in human intellect that's actually a testament to we do have some control over our mode of consciousness. The very fact that we can identify with AI and then define thinking that way and so do it, yeah, that's a testament that we could have gone a different way, precisely as we lose the capacity to go a different way. That's the great horror here. Like, the problem with freedom is that you're free to choose to not believe you're free. You're free to choose determinism if you want. That's always the issue. And then it will be as if you were never free. And so I think the stakes are quite high. I think also in those kind of contracts, because I've been with the phenomenology of spirit, there's always the limit that you hit that then invites the next change, the limit of the there's a kind of like consciousness is hitting a certain kind of, okay, y'all gone a long time ignoring Owen Barfield and Steiner and all the relational guys. Y'all are hitting the limit. Now you're free, so you can just go on and blow yourself up if you want. But, maybe y'all should check that out a little bit, maybe. But because you're free, you can choose to have the limit efface you. Or you can choose to have a more sublative or opening up the opportunity. The old thing, the cliche is that a crisis is an opportunity and so on and so forth. But I do think there's truth to that. The beauty, this is where actually for me, the meaning crisis can actually kind of be a sign of hope in a few reasons. Because the very fact that you feel that this isn't working then can make you, because you're experiencing that, open to alternatives where otherwise you may not have been. Right? Like, you may not have been open to considering like an Owen Barfield or a Whitehead or a Planier until you get to this place where it's like, we seem to be at a kind of dead end, right? So there's a kind of possibility there. Also, I would note, there is a kind of hope in the meaning crisis because we kind of do know how to get meaning. Called like xenophobia, nationalism, closed-mindedness, racism, and more. We actually know how to get meaning. The issue is that we've decided we don't want to do those ways of getting meaning. We're looking for a better alternative. Well, that means we're trying to figure out, we've hit some sort of wall that we need to think, and AI is simply asking that. In a way, I guess I would put it like there's a way, and it's in the way where if the phenomenon is that what does this say about consciousness to be able to experience this thing in this way? We should ask, how is this crisis for a different choice of freedom? Like, how is this for a different mode of consciousness, right? And if we think of it that way, I think there's a lot of positive potential with that. I would also say, like, if the exemplar thing that you were pointing out, I think that's exactly right. Exemplars seem to have a real power of inspiring and showing people a different opportunity. But here's one of the reasons why. We were saying you need to see the tree and then imagination, right? It's not just ideas, there's an experience. An exemplar is kind of like that, right? You see the model, you see the person. It's not just information. It's not just, you should be like this. You see it as a whole and living. So the experience of an exemplar can be like really encountering the tree in the forest, and thus it can have a uniquely imaginative capacity. That's the key. Like, reading what a good person is doesn't seem to explode or inspire the imagination, like seeing an exemplar, right? And it's interesting because Korobowski actually kind of notes visualization as being an alternative to identification in his book on the science of sanity, where we need more visualization. And I think that ties to the seeing of the tree that we're talking about. The reason why I say all this is because a reason I do have hope is because precisely, you were talking about the Zoom conversation, the YouTube we're talking about. This is a kind of possible exemplar coordination mechanism that has never been possible in human history before. You can then see video, and this technology is arising alongside the AI, presenting the kind of choices, right? Like we've had pricing mechanisms to coordinate distributions of limited resources, commodity forms. One thinks of a hike, a mimesis, or different things, but we've really not had, dare I say, an exemplar coordination or an ability to better coordinate people to exemplars and say, oh my gosh, I didn't know philosophy could not be boring. Look at these YouTube people. My experience of philosophy in school was terrible. Look at this. Wow, I didn't know you could actually have 3-hour conversations that weren't making you want to lose your mind. Look at that. Wow, it looks like people can forget how much time passes. It becomes an exemplar of a kind of relationality that I think you could also associate with friendship. If that has not been possible in history, that kind of social coordination, therefore, people who fall in love with reality has mostly, dare I said, been pretty random. If you are lucky to get the teacher, lucky to have the grandfather, to have the exemplar, then that was great. We're entering an age where that might be able to be better coordinated, thus better coordinate valuation, better coordinate imagination, thus opening up new horizons by which people value reality, axiology, to help us move out of things causing ecological crises, environmental, a new spirit and a new mode of exchange. So I'm quite bullish, the liminal web, as people call it. This is a social coordination mechanism. This is an exemplar coordination mechanism to show that, hey, did you know there actually are hundreds of people that are reading books simply for their own sake, not because of certification, because they actually value the ideas there? And if we follow the sociologists like a Berger or a Reef, people need, you see permission to do that. Well, you can do that actually with your free time, and that enables you to feel like you can do it as well. It creates groups. It creates a decentralization of lifelong learning. I know that Segal like wonder as the excess kind of value that we were talking about, lifelong learning. Matt was talking about that on Substack. This technology does provide that possible showing of the exemplar and inspiration of that. That could create a kind of excess value that is not captured in the commodity form, thus opening new markets, thus opening new ways of socioeconomic exchange. So I think that point on the exemplar is exactly right. And the beauty is that we may have now technology that allows a coordination of that. And I'll pass it on, but like in all great stories, that opportunity is arising alongside the ChatGPT. So it's like, it's like a battle, right? Like you have to choose, 2 roads go in the woods, and choose a good one, buddy. Everyone knows that poem. So, choose well, but it's kind of arisen together. But let me pass it on.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Any thoughts occurring to you, Ashton?
Well, I was hearing in what you were describing, Daniel, especially when you connected what we're encountering with ChatGPT and this larger narrative, which we could say is a choice, a choice that we are collectively making through the imagination. And maybe I shouldn't say we as in everyone's doing that, because that's kind of what we're being critical of. But that you described the meaning crisis and this larger or I guess related scenario with AI as kind of like symptoms, right? And maybe foils as well for the impetus to change. And I was thinking earlier that Barfield actually, at the end of Saving the Appearances, he raises this question about the imagination. He's like, it's not just a good thing. It can be good or evil. And that seems to be one of the major issues right now, is that this narrative about the AI technologies being equivalent or like surpassing even human thinking and even the way that the AI functions itself is a kind of a mirror or an externalization of the way, at least in the Western world, and I think this is sort of true all over the world now, the way that I guess the common sense understanding of what thinking is thinking that is bound to the senses. And so for Steiner, or for Barfield, when he's talking about Coleridge, he talks about imagination as a kind of thinking, as you both have described, where we have this potential to overcome the gap between subject and object. And so there's some kind of connection between imagination and love, even though maybe the ground of imagination is divine love, and the ultimate reality of things. But that, and so really it's like if the issue is because the AI is useful, but it's dangerous when we have a certain imagination imposed on it that is informed by the sense-bound intellect. But if we maintain an imagination of the world that reflects this truer, I think, understanding of thinking, then we'll know the limitations of the technology, and we won't be fooled by ourselves into what and we will not raise the younger generations to think incorrectly about these machines in connection with human beings. And yeah, so like Daniel said of the meaning crisis, we could think about these challenges as symptoms of a challenge that we can take up to continue our evolutionary journey towards something more beautiful and more free. And yeah, may it be so.
Yeah, well said. And it's all quite, of course, these are useful tools. I mean, I'm going to use AI to get the transcript of this conversation later. And but it's like just making sure that we're very careful about distinguishing what's the tool and who is the user of the tool. Because it's very easy, and we're constantly encouraged by the corporate forces that currently are rolling out these tools to think or to engage with these technologies in a way that puts us in the position of being the tool, actually, where our data is being harvested, where our percepts and concepts are being manipulated, such that we are trained increasingly to think like the large language models. And what we've seen, which is possibly a saving grace, is that when you train these machines on their own outputs, they very quickly become stupid and make no sense anymore. So they're parasitic, in other words, on human linguistic expression to be trained on. When you train them on their own outputs, they become they talk nonsense very quickly.
Like
Right. And what's that?
the other tool.
Right. So who's the tool? What's the tool? Who's the user? We need to be clear on that. And really resist the marketing and the PR that wants to convince us that we're talking to a person. Right? That's idolatry. And there are these atavistic forms of participation that, Daniel, you were mentioning, like racism, where we revert to this blood-based connection that in an earlier stage in human evolution maybe was very important for us to feel bound, participating in the tribe, like we are one body and one mind. No longer appropriate in our phase of this evolutionary journey as human beings, to overemphasize blood-based bonds. No longer appropriate to overemphasize nationalism, even though these are tempting moves to make because of the meaning that springs from that sense of having an in-group and a clearly defined enemy. That's a tried and true method for producing a sense of purpose in a human life. But the problem is that those old forms of participation are going to get us all killed, and they're no longer appropriate. And so, yeah, this type of technology, this Zoom medium, video conferencing medium, the ability for us to engage in the electronic media environment and produce planetary culture, I think is a source of hope for me as well. But it's hard because a lot of these platforms, a lot of these social media networks are privately owned and are designed to treat us like we're the product. Our attention is what's being harvested, and that the real users of these social media networks are the advertisers and the companies paying for the ads to siphon our attention. So we need a heightened awareness of the light and the shadow of the media that we engage with, right? Please.
No, not to interrupt.
Daniel.
Everything you said is fantastic. I've been, so for a few things, for me, one of the evidences of that evolution of consciousness is precisely the sense that there are things that in the past, like maybe a blood bond, if you're moving across the train, you need that kind of connection is really important. Now that would be overfitting. There's a sense of overfitting. And one of the reasons why it's really important to kind of, if I'm using that term from computer science correctly, if not, any computer scientist hearing this, you can throw up, I'm sorry, but there's this kind of overfitting of the model. It's like
you're safe with me and Ashton. We have no idea.
Okay, maybe my son outside the door is like, Dad. But you're overfitting at that point, right? Things in the past, but actually the ability to be able to tell what is overfitting and what isn't, and I think the other term is bifurfitting or something like that. That's actually really important. And if you're too inframed or stuck in the logic of the day because you don't have the imagination to move across the stack, it's just kind of probable that you're going to overfit something or wrongly apply something but hey, you look at the history, it's like, well, it used to be good. It used to work for people. Yeah, but things change, but you have to have that way of thinking, right? To see that. So I think that's a really important point. Ivan Illich had this lovely distinction between tools of conviviality and I believe tools of manipulation. And basically his whole idea is that he wasn't like he got into some debates with Ilou, who did that technological society. He's like, look, I'm not like a anti-technology guy, but I'm also like really critical of technology because most of it is manipulative, not convivial. And by convivial, he means a way to think of it is extending humanity versus replacing humanity, of extending friendship and relationship, facilitating it versus manipulating it away, right? So here's the $1 million question. How do you tell the difference between a tool of conviviality versus a tool of manipulation? What is your metric by which to identify it, right? Because, like if you ask people, is TikTok bad? I don't know of anyone who says no. Most people who say, no, they all say, of course it is, and proceed to use it, right? Like people know that addiction to cell phone is bad. They know all of these things are bad and proceed to continue doing it, right? So simply the information that this is bad is not enough. There has to be a transformation in habits, right? Which starts talking about experience, exemplars, and so on and so forth, right? But there's also a question like, what is the metric by which one wants to get a sense of when a tool is more on the side of manipulation versus conviviality? So let's take the liminal web. There's a way in which you could always find another incredible video and another incredible lecture and just listen forever and, never touch grass is the phrase, right? That's there. And yet that same technology could actually allow social coordination and conviviality that was never before possible, right? So simply saying the technology is good or bad is not enough, right? Because the same technology could be used for manipulation or for conviviality, extending humanity versus replacing. So what is the metric? Well, I'll talk personally, and this is one of the reasons why I am quite a fan of the imagination as primary. I ask myself, when is the technology inhibiting imagination? Not is it more rational to use, because it's always more rational to use. You increase your algorithm, you increase your funding, you learn more. Rationality would have you always use the technology more, right? Because you learn more and you get more connections and you get more, right? So if you ask yourself, should I do more, as a kind of quantitative question, then it's going to probably have you get manipulated or burn out or exhausted, or you lose your attention and awareness, as a McGilchrist or a Simone Weil or an Ivan Illich as well would say is like the most important thing ever, right? Like that capacity. So for me, I ask questions of when does this technology inhibit my imagination? Those moments where I'm walking and there's an idea, those moments where something could capture me. So let me make an example. I don't have a cell phone, but I'm not anti-phone. I do have a flip phone for work calls, but I don't have a smartphone. Why? Because if I'm carrying a phone that at any moment somebody can call me, then I can be interrupted, right? And also it can train people for when they talk to me, they don't have to think about everything they're going to say. They can just, and then call again 5 minutes later when they remember, right? So that creates a fragmented experience. And then critically, I know there's a phone in my pocket, so I'm actually distracted even if it's not ringing. My ability, and then what you find is actually your capacity to just be in that daydreamy space, that daydreamy space. It's really hard for me to say that just there. That imaginative space of thinking becomes less. But a phone that is on a shelf in a kind of locked location doesn't have that impact. And it's really useful to have a phone. Likewise, I find that something like if I watch a YouTube lecture, for example, and I make myself write down notes for it, that naturally leads you from having an infinite consumption because you have to do something with it, right? And so for me, the reason why, the main thing I'm saying, my metric for my relationship with technology is really a question of paying attention to its dynamics and its impact on my capacity to be imaginative, to enter into a daydream space. If the technology is taking away from that, then I need to change my relationship to it. If it is enhancing that, then this is a good technology. This is something I could continue to do. But I personally have not found it helpful to ask, what's the rational way to use the tech? Is it good for business? Well, of course it's good to always be connected for business. You could miss a customer, right? Like, that's not going to help you. Like, in fact, for work, you should always have your smartphone on you because the boss may send you an email at midnight. Well, that's a big, I think they just passed a law in Europe about that, right? Because it's such a crisis, right? Like asking, is it good for work? Will it help my career? Will I make more money? Stuff like that. That's not going to help you on the question of the dynamics of technology, because basically it will always be, yes, use the technology more. But if you ask questions of imagination, daydreaming, the ability to suddenly have an idea come out of nowhere that you've never had before, that can, for me at least, be a more useful metric for determining, should I use the technology this way or not, right? And so that's one thing. And but the only way, and then I'll close, the only way to think about one's relationship to technology in this manner is to make imagination primary, to make that daydreaming thing primary, right? Like, if that's not primary for you, well, then you're just going to ask, is it good for work? Is it good for rationality? And it will be a spurious infinity in a way. It will always have you use it more. And the chances, and under that heuristic of determining your relationship with technology, it seems very unlikely that you will have a relationship to it that won't ultimately be consumptive, having the algorithm taking over, addictive, replacing humanity versus extending humanity. And then lastly, if we think about that with AI, the question becomes, how do I use AI to enhance imagination? And that then is a different question from simply how do I use it to enhance work? How do I answer questions with it? All of which could be useful tools. But imagination actually could carve out the human space that the tool could be used to extend humanity, but could not replace. In a way, you can ask, maybe there are certain, I was speaking to Alex Ebert about this, and then I'll pass it on. Maybe there are certain genres of music, certain forms of art, certain it's really hard to think of like an entirely new art form, right? Like you got dance, you got paint, you got writing, you got singing. What if there are forms of art we can't even think of
Is it frozen?
Yeah, we've lost you again, Daniel. Imagining forms of art that haven't even been
I was excited.
conceived yet.
There he is.
I have
You're-
never had this much trouble. I have never had this much
It's only
trouble.
happened twice, so it could
I'm-
be worse.
Well, you're a gentleman. It's this country Virginia email. I say so. I don't know where it stopped, but I was saying something like
You were
we can
just
think
about
of
to
A-
imagine a new form of art for us.
Yeah, well, like what if AI? Yeah, there we go. Like maybe there's something where we say, how could AI help us think of new forms of art? Because that's really hard. That without AI we couldn't have done, but that would extend humanity versus replace humanity, right? That's just maybe AI is a tool for new forms. Because if we say, because otherwise it's always going to be able to write novels, right? And pianos, and we're going to feel replaced. But if we think of it as a tool to open up possibly new forms, if I use that fancy term from philosophy of art or thinking or genres, well, now we have something that extends humanity, right? But that's imaginative. Now we're in the realm of imaginative, and that is a relational dynamic with the technology versus an either or dynamic with the technology. So anyway, using Mr. Illick's on the manipulative versus the conviviality, that helps me. And then taking imagination as primary, because then is this technology getting in the way of my capacity to just find myself imagining myself in a place or a poem? Like, is my capacity just to be in that place harder? Like, is it harder? If so, I need to rethink my relationship with the technology, because it's probably more on the side of manipulation than conviviality. So that's one thing. And then if it is true that actually like there's this huge percent of productivity in economics that actually depends on creativity and imagination that are always modeled out, that you could call the shadow work side in Ivan Illich, it's actually all of this imagination work of which society is dependent on, then actually figuring out these dynamics is incredibly practical and socially impactful for all the people that are concerned about how is this like practical and productive. There's good evidence to suggest that it's extremely important, because by not taking this stuff seriously, we're not economics ceases to extend humanity. It begins replacing humanity, because it's not relational with us and we're not able to be convenial. So I think the practical impacts are significant as well.
How to discern whether these tools are contributing to or degrading human flourishing is such an important question right now. Convenience versus conviviality. Such an important inquiry. And, I think to understand the answer to that question, and that we should move towards wrapping up here, we have to know what the human is, first of all.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
And there's all this talk of transhumanism, and the creators of a lot of these new AI technologies, the tech leaders, are increasingly converts to a new religion. Transhumanism is one word for it, where the human is a bridge and the machines are to replace us. But there are other ways of thinking about the human being as a bridge that are not replacement theories, if I can use that, repurpose that term. And so, I think Dante uses the word transhuman, actually. I forget the original Italian, but he's also thinking of the human being as something that we do go beyond, but in what way? And who is Christ as an exemplar is human, but also something else. And that something else is what we're called to. And yeah, that's our situation. Trying to build this bridge into the future and to become the beings that we can become as a result of these divine powers of freedom and love. Actually, the freedom is probably a human power uniquely, and love would be the divine power. Put it that way. So let's, any closing thoughts that either of you want to share, and then we can bring this delightful conversation to a close. Ashton, you want to?
Sure. Yeah.
go
Yeah.
first?
I also, as Daniel was speaking, this distinction between the convivial and the convenience technologies, and I really appreciate the way you put it, that rationality is not does not serve us really when we're trying to assess. Because I have had that same experience. I'm like, well, should I put my phone on silent? If I don't have it on silent, then I'm not going to hear this. And yeah, and so this question about how to assess, when a technology is being, I guess, toxic, I guess, for lack of a better word. There's this, question about what it means to be human and what a human life can be, and what is really every human being's birthright. And I think it is bound up with that, with what you were describing, having space for that reverie. And it reminds me of what Charles Taylor, and at least in A Secular Age, he talks about the higher times, like this kind of that contemplative space where we have this capacity to exceed the like workaday survival time. And it seems that the transhumanist visionary, or imaginary, has a specific idea of the human, and also of I guess what evolution is leading to, that is doesn't have room for that. It doesn't seem to. It seems to be just all kind of Darwinian strife. Because what's going to happen when, I guess, we give way to the machines? What are they going to do? Are they going to worship, or just make space for contemplation? Yeah, all in there. So yeah, the question of what it means to be human, and this significance of what is all this work for?
Well, I've enjoyed this immensely. This Ashton, has been wonderful speaking with you, and I agree with Matt. Like, Owen Barfield is needed more than ever before. So thank you for your work to help get him out there, because I think his thinking is very powerful. I mean, I think at the end, like you were mentioning the end, there's that idea that when Jesus does the parable of the seed, I believe, it's like in this kind of, and he asked the question of, why does Jesus then ask them, do you understand? He gives them like the meaning of it, right? And there's this kind of idea, if I recall, that the seed that one throws out is imagination, and the soil we put it on determines if it grows or not. And if we use imagination simply to create technologies that replace humanity, then we've used the word of God in a destructive way, in a way that is not fitting. But if we throw the seed on a soil of conviviality, then we're using imagination in the right way. But we're free to choose. We have that freedom. And it is a very interesting question on what is the human being. I think I think a lot about friendship. There's a way in which the human is a friend. And friendship is really interesting, because friendship, like you mentioned Dante, Dante and Beatrice were not married. Beatrice is someone who Dante sees in the Viva Nova, and it's kind of like a friendship relationship, right? And it's this kind. Now, obviously, there's eros, because the logic of the commedia is a kind of movement of eros, right? But there's kind of a friendship dynamic too that is also wrapped in beauty. And there's also, I think, a lot about where, at the end of The Closing the American Mind, Alan Bloom says this kind of really weird line. He's like, yeah, basically, without philosophy and the humanities, friendship is impossible. What? And then he just kind of ends it. He doesn't really go into detail. Obviously, you have Nietzsche on friendship, you have Cicero on friendship, but there's something about friendship that's very, very interesting. And because friendship seems to also be not merely association, but the ability to get lost in the other in a kind of fullness of time. Timothy Keller talks about self-forgetfulness, which is not selfish or selfless, but you just forget yourself, like using your thumb. Likewise, when you're with friends and having a good talk, you just forget yourself. You could call it the flow state, if you will. But there's a kind of forgetfulness that occurs that becomes a quality of a good friendship, which then I think that is something that poetry introduces you to, because it requires that versatility of perspectives and topics and the movement around, precisely to maintain the flow state. Like, if you're like, how do you keep a good jazz improv going, right? If the pianist is too stuck in the classical style, then he's going to break the improv and it all becomes awkward, right? So there's that ability to move beyond the track, the single subject, that allows you to enter into that dynamic. And so poetry as a mode of being seems to invite friendship And friendship is at its highest when it seems to engage in a kind of self-forgetfulness or flow, which has a kind of characteristic of that awe, seeing something beautiful and you're in awe of it. You just want to be there. You don't want the party to end. You just want to see the tree, right? And that's kind of the opposite of consumption. Because in awe, like, you know, a awe economy, if you will, is one way, in a way where you're consuming the tree by observing it, but there's a way which you're consuming Dante, and yet you're not, because you're actually participating in the beauty of that person. It's more participatory in an Owen Barfield sense. It is more like friendship has this participatory character. And I think that's why for Ivan Illich, the question of friendship was huge. And the question of how do we use technology to extend humanity, for me, gets tied to the question of how do we better facilitate friendship? And then if we can create exemplars of that to show what it can look like to do that, and how the humanities, poetry, philosophy, and all of that is actually critical for that possibility, and helping people relate in that way, I think that can go a long way to helping with things like the meaning crisis, because I think the meaning crisis is tied to the friend session that some people talk about in like lost connections, right? But then the question is, what is friendship? And I think it's an extension of humanity, and it ultimately is what humanity is about, because it's a relationship that is cherishing and being lost in for the sake of the relationship itself and the quality of experience it makes possible that is possible no other way. And then, like a poem opens a new form of consciousness, friendship, likewise, like a poem, opens a new mode of consciousness. So I think that's important today.
Amen.
Lovely place to end. The shift from the mode of relationship of consumption to one of communion. And I think friendship speaks to that quite beautifully. And maybe I'll close with these lines actually from the intro, the foreword by G.B. Tennyson to Barfield's lectures here on History, Guilt, and Habit, where he quotes Lewis, who says of Owen Barfield that he was the type of every man's second friend, the man who disagrees with you about everything. He's not so much the alter ego as the anti-self. So one can have a friendship wherein, you know, you're really able to go deep and lose yourself in the importance of the communion and the vision it provides you. You know, you need two eyes to see. And so friendship, you know, having more than one perspective, entering into deep dialogue, I think is the only way to learn ultimately. So gentlemen, thank you both. Really enjoyed this.
It's been a blast.
Go out and read Owen Barfield, everyone.
Great to meet you.
Go read Owen Barfield, everyone. It's been a treat. Thank you, Matt, Ashton. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Have a good night, Daniel.
All the
Have a good night,
best.
Ashton. See you guys next time.
All the best. Have a good one.